My name is Marin Ellery. I'm 35 years old, and last Sunday night, my father raised a glass of red wine over my mother's pot roast and congratulated my younger sister for buying her dream retreat with the money from my late grandmother's house. Not a house he owned. Not a house my mother owned. A house my grandmother Evelyn left to me. The Whitaker House had stood on Linden Street since 1928, with blue-gray siding, walnut stairs, and a sewing room at the back where my grandmother had hemmed wedding dresses for half the women in Staunton. I had been gone 5 months on a preservation contract in Savannah, restoring storm-damaged homes for strangers who still understood what it meant to lose a place. When I came back, my parents called it a welcome home dinner. Lydia had a glossy brochure spread beside her plate: 12 acres outside Charlottesville, a converted barn, a yoga deck, a pond she kept calling healing water, as if naming something made it holy. My father, Russell Vance, smiled like a man who had solved a family problem. "Your grandmother's house was sitting there doing nothing," he said. "Now it's finally giving your sister a future." My mother reached for my hand. "Marin, you've always been the sensible one." That was what she called me when I gave up my bedroom at 9. When I paid my own tuition. When Lydia cried and everyone looked at me to fix the air in the room. Then Lydia laughed softly and said, "At least Grandma's dusty old place finally helped someone build something beautiful." I set my fork down. I did not cry. I did not ask how they dared. I looked at the three of them, then at the brochure, and I laughed. Lydia's smile disappeared. "What is funny?" I wiped my mouth with the napkin and said, "I was just wondering who buys a protected 1,928 house without reading the county record." They thought grief had made me cruel. 3 days later, the buyer's certified letter arrived. Please subscribe to support the channel. Here's a fun little challenge. I bet you are watching this video while lying down with your legs crossed right now. If I guess correctly, type 3 in the comments. If not, type 4. Let's see how many viewers I got right. And if you enjoy this story and would like to support our team, please consider buying us a cup of coffee through the link in the description. Your support helps us continue creating more meaningful, emotional, and captivating stories for you. Thank you so much for your kindness and support. All right, enough talking. Let's begin the story. My family had been calling me sensible for so long that I did not hear the insult in it until I was almost 30. When I was 9, Lydia wanted the front bedroom because the morning light made her feel safe. That was the word my mother used. Safe. I remember standing in the hallway with my pillow under one arm while Lydia cried on the carpet behind her. My room had the bigger window, the deep closet, the view of the maple tree. Hers had a wall that faced the neighbor's garage. My mother knelt in front of me and smoothed my hair behind my ear. "You understand things better than your sister," she whispered. "You're my sensible girl." So I moved. By 16, I knew the shape of that word. Sensible meant I bought my own winter coat with bookstore money, while Lydia got dance costumes because she had real talent. Sensible meant I took the bus home from debate practice so my father could drive Lydia to voice lessons. Sensible meant when there was one slice of pie left, nobody asked who wanted it. They looked at me and waited for me to say I was full. For years, I mistook that waiting for trust. My grandmother Evelyn never did. She lived alone in the Whitaker House on Linden Street, 3 miles from my parents, but somehow in another country entirely. Her house smelled like lemon oil, thread, old paper, and the spearmint tea she drank from chipped blue cups. In the back room, beside the tall window, sat her black Singer sewing machine, the kind with gold lettering worn thin by use. Women from church came there with sleeves to shorten and wedding dresses to let out. Girls came in crying because a zipper broke 2 hours before prom, and they left with Evelyn pinning the fabric between her fingers like she was stitching their confidence back in. Every summer, she let me stay with her for 2 weeks. Not because Lydia needed space. Not because my parents were tired. Because she wanted me there. That was the first place I learned the difference. At my grandmother's, I did not have to earn quiet. I did not have to make myself smaller so someone else could feel large. She would hand me a soft cloth and say, "Wood remembers hands, Marin. Be gentle with what has held people up." I thought she was talking about furniture. Years later, I understood she was talking about me. There was a blue tin box she kept in the sewing room closet, tucked behind folded table linens and old Christmas ribbons. I saw it often, but she never let me open it. Once, when I was 26, I teased her about hiding treasure. She smiled without looking up from her needle. "Not treasure," she said. "Promises." I forgot that word for a long time. Or maybe I only thought I did, because 3 days after that dinner, when my father's phone started ringing and my mother's voice cracked for the first time in my life, all I could think about was the blue tin box, still sitting in the sewing room of a house my father had sold to a man who had no idea what was inside. My grandmother died on a Thursday morning in October of 2022, and by Saturday afternoon my father was already walking through the Whitaker house like a man estimating what could be removed. Not what could be saved. Removed. The funeral had been over less than 3 hours. There were still paper plates on the kitchen counter. Still half a lemon cake from the church ladies sitting under plastic wrap. Still a row of damp coats hanging by the back door because it had rained during the service. I was in the sewing room when he found me. I had gone there because the rest of the house was full of voices using that careful tone people use around grief, soft enough to be polite and loud enough to avoid silence. The room itself did not pretend. Evelyn's black singer sat beneath the window, threaded with pale blue cotton. Her measuring tape still hung over the chair. A stack of condolence cards rested unopened on the side table, as if even paper needed time before being handled. My father stood in the doorway with my mother behind him, and Lydia leaning against the hall wall, scrolling on her phone like death was taking too long. Russell looked around the room and sighed. "Place like this eats money," he said. "Roof, taxes, insurance. Your grandmother was sentimental, but we don't have to be." I turned slowly. She left it to me. He gave a small laugh. Not cruel exactly. Worse, patient. Like I had said something childish in front of adults. "Legally, maybe," he said. "But morally, this belongs to the family." That was the first time I heard him separate those two words and choose the one that let him take more. My mother touched his arm, warning him to soften the edge, then looked at me with funeral eyes. "Your father only means we should all talk before any decisions are made." But Lydia looked up from her phone and glanced at the sewing machine. "What would anyone even do with this room?" she said. "Start a museum for old women?" The sentence landed so cleanly that for a second I could not move. My grandmother had spent 40 years making sure other women did not walk into important rooms feeling unfinished, and my sister had reduced all of that to clutter. Caleb was there too, Lydia's husband, standing near the stairs with his car keys tight in his fist. He opened his mouth like he might say something. Then Lydia gave him one quick look, and whatever was almost decent in him stepped backward. His eyes dropped to the floor. Nobody corrected her. I folded one of Evelyn's embroidered handkerchiefs, the one with EW, stitched in the corner, and slipped it into my coat pocket. I did not argue that day. I told myself grief made people careless. I told myself a name on a deed was stronger than a family's opinion. I was wrong about that, because my father was not grieving the house, he was studying it. And before I left the sewing room, I saw him glance once toward the closet door, as if he had just realized grief had drawers, closets, and paperwork he had not priced yet. For the next 2 years, I kept the Whitaker house the way you keep a promise you are not yet strong enough to live inside. I paid the taxes, renewed the insurance, replaced the porch railing when the wood softened under my thumb, and drove out on weekends to open the windows. I was not ready to move in. I was not ready to let it go either. So when a 5-month preservation contract came up in Savannah, in March of 2025, I told myself the money would help me do right by the house. That was the simple version. The cleaner one. The version I gave my parents when my mother asked why I would go all the way to Georgia when there was still so much work waiting on Linden Street. The contract paid well. The roof over my grandmother's back porch had started to sag, and the upstairs windows needed reglazing before winter. Old houses do not fall apart all at once. They ask for help in small, expensive sentences. What I did not say was that I needed distance before grief learned how to lock me inside. Every visit to Linden Street felt like walking into a room where someone had just stopped speaking. I would unlock the front door and wait for Evelyn's voice to call from the sewing room. I would find only still air, dust in the hallway light, and the faint scent of lavender soap in the upstairs bath. I loved that house. I also could not stand inside it for more than an hour without feeling like my ribs had been laced too tight. So when Savannah called, I said yes, before guilt could put its hand on my shoulder. The week before I left, a spring storm peeled 2 shingles off the back slope of the roof. Mabel Kincaid called me before breakfast. "Nothing dramatic," she said, which was how Mabel described everything short of a house fire. "But if rain comes sideways, you'll want someone local with a key." She was right. I could not make a full day's drive every time a gutter clogged or a tax notice came by mail. That was how I made the mistake that would later be explained to me as if I had invited it. I asked my father to help. I met Russell at my parents' kitchen table on April 4th. The form was 1 page, a property caretaking document I had used before on preservation jobs. Not a sale document, not a transfer, not permission to erase anything. I had highlighted the important lines in yellow because that is what I do for clients who pretend not to understand plain English. Pay utilities. Receive tax notices. Authorize emergency repairs. Handle routine maintenance. I slid it across the table and said, "Dad, this is only if the roof leaks, the city sends a notice, or something breaks while I'm gone." He put on his reading glasses, the cheap pair he kept beside the napkin holder, and skimmed it with the impatience of a man who believed paperwork was for people who did not trust their own family. My mother stood by the sink, drying the same plate for too long. "You see?" she said softly. "This is why we can count on you, Marin. You make things easy." I remember that sentence because it warmed me for half a second before I understood the shape of it. Easy was just sensible wearing nicer clothes. Russell tapped 1 finger against the line that said handle routine maintenance. "And if there's a serious offer?" he asked. He did not look at me when he said it. He looked at the paper. I laughed once, tired and small. "There won't be an offer. It's not for sale." He folded the document carefully, too carefully, and slid it into a folder beside his elbow. "I know how to handle a house," he said. At the time, I heard a father trying to sound useful. Later, I would hear the other sentence hiding underneath it. The morning I left Virginia, I drove by Whitaker House before sunrise. The hydrangeas were only beginning to leaf out, thin green hands opening under the porch rail. I checked the back door twice. I set the thermostat. I left a note on the kitchen counter for myself, a list of repairs to start when I came home. Back porch roof, upstairs windows, sewing room ceiling stain. Then I locked the door and put the spare key in an envelope for my father. On the outside, I wrote, in black ink, "House key, emergencies only." I handed it to him in his driveway an hour later. He tucked it into his jacket pocket without reading the envelope. That should have told me something. But trust is rarely broken in the moment you hand it over. It breaks later, when you understand the other person heard permission where you gave responsibility. I drove south that morning, believing I had protected the house as well as I could. I did not know the most dangerous thing I left behind was a man with my key, my signature on a caretaking form, and a definition of family broad enough to swallow anything I owned. By July, Savannah had settled into my skin in the way humid places do. My apartment smelled faintly of old plaster and wet brick no matter how long I ran the air conditioner. Every morning, I walked through houses with blue tarps for roofs and water lines on the walls, writing reports for families who stood beside me holding folders of receipts like prayer books. They wanted me to tell them what could be saved. They wanted a number, a sentence, a way forward. I was good at that. I could be useful in a stranger's ruined hallway. That morning, I was standing in the front room of a Victorian on East Broad Street, looking up at a ceiling stain shaped like a continent, when my phone buzzed in my back pocket. Mabel Kincaid. I almost let it go to voicemail because the homeowner was explaining how her husband had installed the crown molding himself. Then it buzzed again. And again. Mabel was not a woman who called 3 times unless the thing on fire had already spread. I stepped onto the porch and answered. For a moment, all I heard was wind against her phone and the faint metal clank of her gate. Then she said, "Honey, there's a sign in Evelyn's yard." My hand tightened around the clipboard. "What kind of sign?" I asked, though some part of me already knew before she said it. "The kind with a red strip across the top," she said. "It says sold." I remember staring at the porch floorboards under my shoes. Savannah pine, recently replaced, wrong nail pattern for the age of the house. My mind went there because it could not go to Virginia yet. "That isn't possible," I said. "I own that house." Mabel exhaled through her nose, angry and careful at the same time. "A black truck was here yesterday, man in a pressed shirt. Walked around with your father, took photos, never went inside more than 20 minutes. 20 minutes. That was what stayed with me first. Not sold. Not my father. 20 minutes. A man had spent less time with my grandmother's house than Evelyn used to spend choosing thread for a hem. "Did you get his name?" I asked. Mabel did not miss details. "Donovan Rusk," she said. "Rusk Development. I asked him what he planned to do with the place." Her voice hardened. "He said he was going to clear the old structure and put up something useful." Something useful. I had heard that word before. Useful meant Lydia's future. Useful meant my father's math. Useful meant anything old enough to remember people could be called waste if the right person wanted money from it. I thanked Mabel in the flat voice I use when a homeowner is about to hear a number they will hate, and I hung up before she could hear what my breathing had become. I called my father first. No answer. I called my mother. She picked up on the 5th ring and said my name like she had been standing beside a phone waiting for it to accuse her. "Mom," I said. "Why is there a sold sign in Grandma's yard?" Silence. Then, water running, a cabinet closing, all the little sounds people make when they are buying seconds. "Don't make this ugly from Georgia," she said finally. "Your father handled it." Handled it. The word moved through me slowly, unlocking the sentence I had signed in April. I asked where the money was. She said, "We'll talk when you come home." I asked again. She cried then, but quietly, like tears, could blur the facts if she kept them soft enough. "Lydia needed a real chance, Marin. You have your career. You have options. She has children." That afternoon, Lydia posted a photo on Facebook. She stood in front of a split-rail fence, with a sunlit field behind her, and one hand pressed to her heart. The caption read, "Sometimes family makes miracles happen. Retreat dream begins." Under it, a woman from my grandmother's church had written, "Evelyn would be so proud." I stared at that comment longer than the photo. She had no idea she was applauding the sale of the very room where Evelyn once mended her daughter's wedding dress. I sat in my rental car outside the Victorian and took screenshots until my thumb stopped shaking. I did not fly home that night. I had 32 inspections left, 32 families waiting on reports so their insurance checks could move. So I finished the day. I measured rooms. I photographed rot. I wrote down water damage in neat professional sentences. And every line I typed felt like a lesson my own family had forgotten. That night, in my Savannah apartment, I opened a folder on my laptop and named it Whitaker House. I saved Lydia's post, Mabel's call log, the county property page before it changed, and the old photo of my grandmother standing on the front steps in 1974. I did not have a plan yet. I had a sold sign, a developer's name, and a father who would not answer his phone. But I had learned one thing from old houses. When something shifts, you document it. Then you follow it to the paper nobody bothered to read. The next morning, I did not call my parents again. I had learned something from the way my mother cried, and still refused to answer a simple question. People do not hide clean things. They explain them. So I made coffee in the narrow kitchen of my Savannah apartment, opened my laptop, and went to the county records website before the sun came up. It was not dramatic, no music, no thunder, just a blue loading circle, my pulse in my throat, and the quiet humiliation of typing my grandmother's address into a public search bar like I was a stranger to it. The transfer had been recorded 4 days earlier. Seller: Marin Ellery, by Russell Vance, attorney, in fact. Buyer: Donovan Rusk, Rusk Development, LLC. Sale price: $246,000 cash. I read that number twice. Then a third time. Not because it was high, because it was low enough to tell me my father had not sold the Whitaker house. He had dumped it. Even restricted, even old, even needing work. That house and lot should never have gone for a number that small. Fast money always leaves fingerprints. This one left my father's name. I downloaded the deed, the settlement page, and the document he had used to stand in for me. My signature sat at the bottom of the caretaking form, neat and blue from the April scan. Above it were the same lines I had highlighted before I left. Utilities, tax notices, emergency repairs, routine maintenance, no sale, no conveyance, no redevelopment consent, no authority to sign away a house that had never been his. I did not cry when I saw it. I got colder. There is a kind of pain that does not break you open. It shuts every unnecessary door inside you. At 7:18, I called Tessa Monroe. Tessa worked in the archives room at the Staunton Public Library, and she had the gift of making old paper confess without tearing it. We had met years earlier on a courthouse restoration project, both of us standing over a box of mislabeled photographs and muttering about people who thought history organized itself. When she answered, her voice was thick with sleep. "Somebody better be dead or recorded wrong," she said. I looked at the deed on my screen. "Recorded wrong," I said. "Maybe worse." I told her only what I knew, not what I feared. Evelyn, the house, the sale, Rusk Development, the blue tin box I remembered in the sewing room closet. Tessa went quiet in the way archivists do when a file drawer opens in their mind. "Evelyn filed something in 2019, she said slowly. "I remember because she insisted on black ink, not blue, and asked if signatures lasted longer that way." My hand tightened around the coffee mug. "What kind of something?" I asked. Tessa sighed. "I don't want to guess. Let me pull the physical file." That afternoon I called Graham Sutter, a property attorney I had worked with on preservation easements before. I sent him the deed and the caretaking form. He called back 20 minutes later and did not waste a word. "Marin, do not accuse anyone yet. Do not sign anything they send you, and do not tell your father what you're looking for." I stood in the middle of my apartment with the air conditioner rattling behind me. "Why?" I asked. Graham paused. "Because if your grandmother recorded what I think she recorded, your family may have sold a house that is not as sold as they believe." That night, Tessa texted me a photograph from the archives. It showed the top of a yellowed packet stamped by the county clerk. Across the first page, in my grandmother's careful handwriting, were 4 words: Whitaker House Preservation Covenant. I sat down on the edge of the bed because my knees had forgotten their job. I did not know yet what those 4 words could do. I only knew my grandmother had put something in writing before anyone else thought to look. For the first time since Mabel's call, the room did not feel smaller than my breathing. It felt like a door had opened somewhere in the dark, and behind it, Evelyn was still saying no. I came home on August 18th and drove to Linden Street before I went to my apartment, before I called my parents, before I let Virginia feel familiar again. The Whitaker house was still standing, but it looked like someone had already begun teaching it to disappear. The hydrangeas along the porch had been cut down to blunt sticks. A contractor's dumpster sat by the side gate. There was a yellow demolition permit application notice taped crookedly to the front window, and the lace curtains from the sewing room were gone. Mabel was waiting at her fence with both hands wrapped around the top rail. She did not wave. That was how I knew it was worse than she had said on the phone. They cleared the back room yesterday, she told me. 2 men carried out boxes. I told them those were Evelyn's things, and one of them said the buyer wanted the interior ready. Claimed anything left behind transferred with the sale. She swallowed hard. They took the curtains down, honey. Of all the things she could have said, that was the one that made me look away. I walked around the house without touching the door. There was a lockbox hanging from the knob where my grandmother's brass key used to turn. Through the side window, I saw cardboard boxes stacked in the hallway, picture frames wrapped in trash bags. The old rug rolled tight like a body. The sewing room looked pale and wrong without fabric at the window. I thought of the blue tin box and forced myself not to look toward the closet. I still did not know who had opened what. I only knew strangers had been inside a room. My own grief had barely survived entering. That night, my mother texted that everyone was having dinner at 6. Not asking, telling. I went because I wanted to hear them say the thing plainly. My father had a folder waiting beside his plate. Lydia was there with Caleb, her eyes bright in that feverish way people look when they have already spent money they do not have. My mother served baked chicken and green beans, as if food could make theft sit politely at a table. Russell slid the folder toward me before dessert. "This cleans everything up," he said. Inside was a document titled Preservation Covenant Release and Ratification of Sale. My name was typed at the bottom. The signature line waited like an open mouth. "You sign this," he said, "and Donovan moves forward. Lydia keeps her financing, and nobody gets hurt." I read one sentence in the middle of the page twice. Authorized demolition, material alteration, or redevelopment of the structure. My mother reached for my wrist. "Don't punish your sister because you miss your grandmother." Lydia leaned forward then, shaking her head like I was the cruel one. "Grandma is dead, Marin. My children are alive." The room went very still. Even Caleb looked at her that time. I held the pen my father had placed beside the paper, and for one terrible second, 30 years of training lifted my hand for me. Then I set it down. I need a day to read it. My father's face hardened. "You have until Tuesday morning," he said. "If Lydia loses that property, that is on you." I nodded because I knew arguing would only feed them. They thought one day was time for me to calm down. They did not know it was the first day I finally had enough reason never to sign. I did not go home after dinner. I drove to the public library and sat in the parking lot under a light that flickered every few minutes, with the folder from my father's table on the passenger seat beside me. The release form looked harmless from a distance. 2 pages. Black type. My name waiting at the bottom like a trap pretending to be paperwork. But the sentence I had read at dinner would not leave me alone. Demolition, material alteration, redevelopment. Those were not words for preserving charm. Those were words for making a house disappear politely. Tessa met me at the side door, 20 minutes after closing with her hair twisted up, and her reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. "I pulled the local preservation file," she said, holding up a canvas archive bag like it weighed more than paper. We sat at a long table in the genealogy room, the one with green lamps and chairs that squeaked if you breathed wrong. She laid everything out carefully. The covenant packet, an archive copy of the county recording stamp, photographs of Whitaker House from 1931, and a thin cream envelope with my grandmother's handwriting on the front. I touched the envelope first. Not because it mattered most legally, because grief is not always rational, and sometimes the thing with a dead woman's handwriting becomes heavier than the document that can save you. Evelyn had written my name in blue-black ink, slow and careful, the way she used to label jars of buttons by color. Marin, for when the house needs someone stubborn. I sat back. Tessa looked away, giving me privacy in the only way a good friend can, by pretending not to see the moment your face changes. The covenant itself was clear enough that even my father could have understood it if understanding had ever been his goal. Recorded the 14th of June 2019. No demolition without written release from the named preservation beneficiary. No material alteration of the exterior facade, walnut stair, rear sewing room, or original window profiles without review. No commercial redevelopment that changed the residential historic character of the property. And there, on page 4, typed in plain black letters, was my name. Marin Ellery, successor beneficiary and sole release authority upon Evelyn Whitaker's death. I read that line 3 times. Then I read the release form again, the one Russell had pushed toward me beside baked chicken and green beans. Now it looked different, not like a family favor, like a key they had been trying to make me hand over without telling me which door it opened. If I signed, Donovan could tear through every protection Evelyn had written into the record. If I refused, the covenant stayed exactly where she had put it, between Whitaker House and every man who thought old wood was only an obstacle. Tessa slid the cream envelope toward me. "There's a letter," she said. It was filed as supplemental intent, not binding by itself, but it explains why she did it. I opened it with both hands. Evelyn's voice rose from the page without sound. She wrote about the houses being torn down on Linden Street, porches replaced with vinyl, staircases dumped into roll-off containers, rooms that had held births, wakes, card games, and Christmas mornings flattened into lots. Then one sentence stopped me cold. A house is not saved by the people who inherit it. It is saved by the first person brave enough to say no. I put my palm over my mouth. Not to stop crying, to stop myself from making a sound that belonged somewhere more private than a library after hours. For 3 years I had thought Evelyn left me a house because she trusted me to love it. I understood then she had done something harder. She had trusted me to disappoint the people who would ask me to trade it away. She had known love would not be enough. So she put her no in writing before anyone else thought to look. At 9:46, I called Graham from the parking lot. He answered like he had been expecting me. I sent him photographs of every page. 10 minutes later, he called back and said, "Now I can say it clearly. You are the release authority. Without your signature, the covenant holds." I looked through the windshield at the dark library windows. "Can they force me?" I asked. "No," he said, "but they can pressure you until you forget that. So remember it now." I drove back to my apartment with the copies on the seat beside me and the original letter tucked inside my purse. I did not call my father. I did not call Lydia. I did not correct their mistake. They still believed they had one more day to bend me back into the daughter who made things easy. Let them believe it. By morning, Donovan Rusk would start understanding what he had bought. And the certified letter he sent next would prove my father had finally met someone he could not guilt into silence. By morning, Donovan Rusk understood enough to panic, and men like Donovan did not panic quietly. My father called at 8:12, then 8:14, then 8:19. I let each call ring until it became voicemail. At 8:27, my mother texted, "Call your father, this is serious." I looked at the message while standing at my kitchen counter, drinking coffee from a mug Evelyn had once chipped on the edge of the sink. Serious was a word my family only used when their consequences finally reached them. The certified letter arrived at my parents' house before noon. I knew because Russell called again, and this time he left a message. His voice had lost the heavy patience he used when he thought he was educating me. "Marin, there's a lawyer's letter here from Rusk. Something about recorded restrictions and defective authority. He wants the money back. All of it. You need to fix this today." He sounded breathless on the last sentence, as if the letter had taken up space in the room and left him less air. I did not call him back right away. I sat at my small table and wrote down every phrase from his voicemail. Recorded restrictions, defective authority, money back, fix this. Then I forwarded the audio to Graham and asked one question. "Does this help?" He replied 6 minutes later. "More than he knows. Do not delete it." That was when I understood my father was doing what people do when they start losing control. He was turning his fear into evidence and handing it to me one careless sentence at a time. By 3 o'clock, Lydia had sent 14 texts. The first ones were angry, then scared, then decorated with pictures of her children standing in a field beside the retreat property, Piper holding a yellow flower, Beckett squinting into the sun. She wrote, "They already picked where the garden will go. Don't do this to them." I stared at the photograph, longer than I should have. Children make excellent shields for adults who do not want to hold their own mistakes. Caleb called at 4:40. I almost did not answer, but something about his silence at the dinner table had stayed with me. "Marin," he said quietly, "did your parents actually have the right to sell it?" No speech. No accusation. Just a question that should have been asked before a down payment was ever made. I looked at the folder on my table. "Come Sunday," I said, "bring Lydia, and ask her before then exactly where the money came from." After that, I stopped reacting and started arranging. Graham would come as my attorney, not to fight for me in front of my family, but to make sure no one could pretend later that the conversation was only emotional. Tessa would bring the archive copies. Mabel agreed to come too, though she said she would rather sit through a root canal than one of my father's speeches. I printed the power of attorney, the deed, the covenant, the release form, Donovan's certified letter, Lydia's Facebook post, and Evelyn's letter. Then I put them in order. On Sunday afternoon, I drove to my parents' house with a file box on the passenger seat and Evelyn's cream envelope inside my purse. My father opened the door holding a pen, as if the whole problem was still one signature away from disappearing. Behind him, I could see my mother's good table set for company, and the release form waiting in the center like another covered dish. He smiled when he saw me. He had no idea I had not come to sign. I stepped inside and saw exactly what my father had built. Not a family meeting, a room designed to make refusal feel rude. My mother had set out coffee, lemon cookies, folded napkins, the good plates with blue edges. Lydia sat near the window with her arms crossed. Caleb sat beside her but not touching her. Tessa and Mabel were already there, stiff-backed and silent, and Graham stood near the bookcase with his briefcase closed. In the center of the table sat the release form and Russell's pen, placed neatly across it like a bridge I was expected to cross. "Good," my father said, closing the door behind me. "Now, we can settle this." He used the warm voice, the one that made unreasonable things sound like mature compromises. "Marin, everybody here understands emotions are high, but this has gotten out of hand. You sign." Donovan drops the demand. "Lydia keeps her financing, and we stop dragging your grandmother's memory through legal mud." My mother looked down at her cup as if that sentence had hurt her too. It had not. She was waiting to see whether it worked. I sat across from him and placed my file box on the floor beside my chair. I did not open it yet. "Before I sign anything," I said, "I want you to explain what you believed gave you authority to sell the house." Russell's mouth tightened. "We have been over this. You gave me power of attorney." "For what?" I asked. Lydia made a small sound of frustration. "Oh my God, Marin, this isn't a courtroom." Graham finally spoke. "It is not. But words still mean things outside a courtroom." Russell pulled the caretaking form from his folder with the confidence of a man producing the final answer. "It says right here," he said, tapping the page. "Handle the property." He turned it toward me, one finger pressed under the phrase. I did not look at his finger. I looked at his face. "Read the whole line, Dad." He stared at me. "Don't do this. Read the whole line." The room held still around us. Even the old wall clock seemed to tick more carefully. His jaw moved once before his voice came out. "Handle routine maintenance, utilities, tax notices, and emergency repairs." He stopped there, like stopping could make the rest disappear. I waited. Mabel leaned forward. Tessa folded her hands. Caleb looked from the paper to Russell. I said, "Which one was the sale?" Russell's face reddened. "That is not fair. Was it a utility? A tax notice? An emergency repair?" My mother whispered my name, warning and pleading at the same time. I did not look at her. Russell pushed the paper back as if it had betrayed him. "I did what needed to be done," he said. "That house was sitting empty while your sister had a real opportunity." "No," I said. You sold a house you were never authorized to sell, then asked me to sign a second document so your first document would stop looking like what it was. Lydia snapped. Dad was helping me. I turned to her. He was helping you with something that did not belong to him. That was the first moment her certainty faltered. My father reached for the pen again, but his hand did not close around it. You can dress this up however you want, he said. At the end of the day, you are the only one refusing to fix it. I opened the file box then and took out one page. Not the covenant. Not yet. Just Donovan Rusk's certified letter. I laid it beside the caretaking form and turned it so everyone could read the words recorded restrictions and defective authority. No, Dad, I said. I am not refusing to fix it. I am refusing to become the signature that hides it. Russell stared at the certified letter, as if enough staring might change the words. Rusk is trying to scare us, he said. Developers do that. He wants leverage. Graham opened his briefcase then, slowly enough that everyone watched him do it. He placed the preservation covenant beside the letter. Mr. Rusk applied for a demolition permit, he said. It was stopped, because this restriction was recorded in 2019. My father's face shifted. Not shock. Recognition. Small, quick, and gone too fast for anyone except me to catch. Lydia leaned forward. Demolition? Her voice cracked on the second syllable. You told me he was restoring it. Russell snapped. He said he would preserve the charm. I took the release form and pointed to the line I had read until it burned into me. Then why did he need me to authorize demolition, material alteration, or redevelopment? No one answered. My mother pressed a napkin to her mouth. Caleb turned to Lydia slowly, like some part of his marriage had just made a sound he could not ignore. Tessa slid the archive copies across the table. Evelyn filed the local preservation packet herself, she said. I pulled the file. I opened to page 4 and read my own name out loud. Successor beneficiary, sole release authority. My mother whispered. She never told us. Mabel's voice came from the end of the table, clear and dry. She told Russell at the Labor Day picnic. He laughed and said old houses shouldn't have more rights than living people. My father slammed his palm on the table. The cookies jumped. That is not how it happened. Mabel did not blink. It is exactly how it happened. Evelyn cried in my kitchen that night. The room changed after that. Not louder, smaller. The kind of small a room becomes when everybody realizes there is no corner left for the lie to stand in. I took Evelyn's cream envelope from my purse and unfolded the letter. My hands were steady, which surprised me. She wrote why she did it, I said. Then I read the line that had held me upright since the library. A house is not saved by the people who inherit it. It is saved by the first person brave enough to say no. Lydia was crying now, but not softly. So you're choosing a house over your sister? I looked at her, really looked, at the woman who had stood in a sunlit field and called theft a miracle. No, I said. I am choosing not to let you build a healing retreat with money taken from the person you hurt. Caleb's chair scraped back. Lydia, he said. Did you know the down payment came from this sale? She wiped her face with both hands. I knew Dad sold it. I didn't know it was illegal. You knew I did not agree, I said. That was enough. Russell stood then, big and red-faced, reaching for the old shape of himself. I am still your father. I closed Evelyn's letter and slid the pen back across the table toward him. You were my father when I gave you the key, I said. You became something else when you sold the door. It opened. His mouth opened, but nothing useful came out. So I finished it for him. I am not signing away my grandmother, so you can call theft a family decision. The first consequence did not arrive as thunder. It arrived in Graham Sutter's office on a Wednesday morning, in a conference room that smelled like coffee and copier toner. Donovan Rusk sat across from me in a navy suit, jaw tight, pretending anger was the same thing as innocence. I bought a clean deal, he said. Graham placed the power of attorney and the covenant between us. No, I said, before Graham could answer. You bought fast. There's a difference. Donovan wanted out more than he wanted revenge. The demolition permit was dead, the covenant held, and the authority my father used had cracked wide open under the first serious look. The sale was rescinded. The deed came back into my name, where it should have stayed all along. Donovan recovered his $246,000, but he lost his permit fees, his drawings, his attorney bills, and whatever profit he had already imagined. Before he left, he looked at my father and said, "Next time you sell something, make sure it's yours." My parents had already moved the money. $138,000 had gone into Lydia's retreat financing. The rest had patched debts, fees, and things nobody wanted to list out loud. To repay Donovan, Russell and Janine had to take a loan against their own house. My mother called me that night, voice raw with disbelief. "At our age, Marin? You're letting us carry debt at our age?" I said, "No, Mom, I'm letting you carry the consequence of a decision you made without me." Lydia lost the retreat property and the $22,500 deposit. She called me crying so hard I could hear Caleb in the background telling her to breathe. "You could have saved this," she said. I stood in the Whitaker House hallway, looking at the empty place where Evelyn's sewing room curtains used to hang. "No," I said. "I could have paid for it. That's not the same thing." Caleb came by 2 weeks later and apologized on the porch. Not dramatically, just plainly. "We were wrong," he said. All the way down. Russell never apologized. He sent one text. "You made your choice." I looked at it for a long time, then typed back, "Yes. For once, I did." After that, I stopped answering for 90 days. Not because silence punished him, because silence gave me back evenings that guilt used to own. I hired a crew in November. We repaired the porch roof, reglazed the upstairs windows, and restored the sewing room piece by piece. Tessa found the curtains in a storage box. Mabel brought a hydrangea cutting wrapped in wet paper towels. The first night I slept there, the house made all its old sounds around me. Pipes ticking, floorboards settling, wind touching the windows Evelyn had protected before any of us understood why. I placed her cream letter in a frame beside the black singer and laid the handkerchief with EW stitched in the corner beneath it. Then I changed the locks. There is one key now, and it stays with me. My family spent my whole life calling me sensible so I would open doors for them. My grandmother left me a house so I could learn when to close one. The lesson I learned from losing the Whitaker house almost too late is that family love should never require you to disappear. For most of my life, I believed being good meant being easy. I thought peace meant swallowing the unfair thing before it turned into an argument. I thought loyalty meant giving more, bending more, forgiving faster, and pretending not to notice when the people closest to me kept asking for pieces of my life they had no right to take. But real love does not need you small in order to feel safe. Real family does not call your boundaries selfish just because those boundaries finally inconvenience them. Sometimes, the deepest betrayals do not come from strangers. They come from people who know exactly where your guilt lives. They know the old words that make you soften. Responsible, sensible, ungrateful, dramatic. They know how to dress theft as sacrifice and manipulation as concern, and because we love them, we often give them one more chance to hurt us, hoping this time they will see our pain before they use it. But healing begins the moment we stop confusing silence with kindness. That does not mean we stop loving people. It means we stop letting love become a tool used against us. It means we can honor our parents without obeying their dishonesty. We can care about our siblings without paying for their choices. We can grieve what a family should have been while still protecting what is left of ourselves. My grandmother did not leave me a house, just made of wood, glass, and old stairs. She left me a lesson. Some doors are sacred because of what they protect. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is not fight loudly, but stand still, hold the line, and say no. So if this story touched something in you, I hope you remember this. You are not cruel for protecting what was entrusted to you. You are not selfish for refusing to be used. And you are not breaking the family by telling the truth. Sometimes, the truth is the first honest foundation a broken family has ever had. If you connected with Marin's story, please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment below, and tell me, have you ever had to choose peace with your family or peace within yourself?